when you're going through life, going back to our conversation about every idea has its time, right? Or doesn't have its time. But a good idea, if it's not delivered at the right time, there is no idea. It needs to be in the right moment. The most important, I think, skill that people can have in life is being able to feel exactly where they are and feel the context of their moment and exactly what that moment needs. And I guess my golf demonstrated to me what it felt like to truly love something. And then I found that I was able to remind myself that I was experiencing that with writing, where I was like, I should keep doing this because there's just no doubt in my head that this is what I'm meant to do.
Welcome to The Bag Drop, Untold Stories in Golf. I'm your host, Matt Constein, here with our co-host, the Professor, Dr. Moore. Top of the morning, sir.
Good morning to you. How's your morning going? We always start with what's going on in my life. Let's kick it back to you for once.
Kids were fantastic. Mom was to work early. Dad had a couple meetings before you and I get to have this chat with a gentleman that we've been excited to chat with today. And yeah, everything was in order, which is very rare, very unusual to come, roll in to the desk stress-free, but excited nonetheless. How was your morning?
It's good. We're just we're 48 hours from getting on a cruise ship right now, so trying to knock out everything, clean up every little small loose end. Because when I get on the ship, I like to just put the computer in the safe and the phone in the safe and don't touch them for several days.
So here's the question for the Professor this year: more cruises or more golf tournaments? Which one are you capping out at?
More golf. More golf. Not playing and not back to the tournament mode yet, but definitely more golf this year. This is a say yes to golf year, and we might have already put more rounds in this summer than all of summer last year on just this first sort of run.
Yeah, you've been a busy boy and seeing some cool places, but kind of leisure golf, new club golf, like fun, enjoyable golf, not you out there grinding on the competitive Mid-Am circuit. Replacing that with cruises, phenomenal choice. I think good for Claire, good for you. Excited for both you guys.
I love the disconnect that you get on a cruise ship. I didn't think I would ever like them. Claire got me to go on a Virgin one, and it's got great food, benefits with no kids, so pretty laid back. I now look forward to it. Never thought I would be that person.
Hey, if I'm going on a cruise, even in my stage of life, it's with no kids. I want that. Sign me up. We got an awesome guest today, guy that we both know, probably me more than you, but I've always enjoyed being around this guy, talking golf with this gentleman. And it's New Club Chicago's captain for this year, 2026. He was ratified and put into office for New Club. And it's Xander Nethercutt. He's a former college golfer himself, played at Kenyon College, and he's a writer. And I think you and I love talking to writers. Yes. I think you and I aspire to be some version of writing, whether it's your academic papers or me spouting off on our blog. But Xander has an interesting path to becoming a writer. He did this essay on the Apple Store, and it caught the attention of Ron Johnson, who's now his co-author in his first ever book called Shop Different: How Retail Revealed Apple's Genius. And I read the essay this morning. I see why it grabbed Ron's attention. I can't wait to get my hands on the book and dive in, because really fascinating, reflection on obviously one of the most powerful, great companies that's ever existed, but really us as consumers and just society. It's fascinating stuff. And it's really cool that he's a part of New Club, that he's our captain this year. So it just felt ideal to get him on the pod to chat.
Yeah, I strongly recommend our listeners go check out his. He's got a couple of different blogs. I know one on Medium, but then xandercutt.com is the one I was checking out, where a lot of the stuff you can read. And I think you bring up writers and what we like, I think why I like to interview writers. I think one of the things about most writers like to write for obviously storytelling, but really to sort out their own thinking. I think you see that in a lot of Xander's work, right? He's playing with ideas, and it's through the exercise of writing that your thinking becomes clear. You look for coherence and incoherence in your own thinking, and you just flesh it out. And I think the best writers have that feature where they see writing as an exercise of thought experiments. And then I think by and large, that means they make our job easier because they're great podcast guests.
For sure. And as a golfer, as a member of New Club, he's just one of those people that always reminds me, the whole mission and the whole thing behind New Club is, people that actually care. They care about their golf, that they, it's not just, I joined this app. It's the people that remind you New Club is a club, and a great one at that. And it's people like Xander that makes that real. It's the ones that show up. It's the ones that play and invite and compete and just make your golf better, make your round better. And so great parallel there for writing and the world of golf at New Club. Any teachings for us, Professor?
Well, I do. I was back in the podcast game, was listening to a recent podcast on sort of eating and sleep health and how those interplay. And, I'm on Instagram too often. Don't use it that much, but I'm still on it too often, which is any use of it, I would say. But, you get all the different reels that you get, and there's so much food and nutrition stuff now. It's kind of one of the buzz things going on. What should you eat? What shouldn't you eat? Being clean? Do you do seed oils? And you can go down some deep, deep rabbit holes. But there is a pretty important distinction when you're looking at the foods that you're eating. Obviously, hopefully you're eating for health benefits. And there's two really stark differences of the health benefits that you'll see foods get tagged with. One is just, and let me make sure I get these words right here. One is just structure function claims. So this would be like, why do you drink dairy, let's say? Well, you want calcium. That helps with bones, right? That helps your bones grow. And that is just a straight structure function claim. There's a mechanistic understanding of why that happens. And what you're eating just naturally influence the structure or function of the human body. So calcium builds strong bones, fiber maintains bowel regularity, antioxidants support a healthy immune system, right? There's a strict function to what they're doing. Now, in that world, there's actually not a lot of oversight because it's just those are mechanistic claims. We understand the mechanistic aspects behind them. It just, that works, and that's how it helps the body. Now, on the other side, they're functional or health claims. So these would be something like oats reduce cholesterol levels. So this is like linking a food or nutrition to something that it actually reduces or improves a condition of. These do get held to rigorous scientific standards. These are demonstrated, have to go through lots of experimental studies before they're actually approved by the FDA and that. So the distinction there is if it says supports heart health, that's a structure function claim, lower bar of proof. If it says reduces the risk of something, that's a authorized health claim that's backed by significant scientific standards. So when you're out there looking at, what does the food do, just think, this is just normal function of my body it's helping out, or is this actually trying to reduce something or reduce some disease? And there's different standards there. So a little bit of background on the food industry and the different standards that they're held to or not held to.
It's actually really helpful for me right now because I'm, talking to AI about my inflammation, trying to take a little less Advil to start my mornings after, a couple rounds of golf and playing with the kids in the backyard. And so I'm doing a lot of that. I'm going to keep those classifications in mind. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
always bringing something.
Good luck with inflammation. If you just Google or just Instagram inflammation, you can go down all the rabbit holes on that.
This is 40. I'm going to eat fish oils, baby, omegas. Before we get on to the show, thanks and a reminder that this podcast, New Club Golf Society, is in partnership with Titleist. Their all-new GTS. Put it simply, Professor, this progression into 2025 in the GT series, and then continuing with lead engineer Stephanie Luttrell and her team into the GTS. It represents probably the most significant technological leap that Titleist drivers have made in their designs. As a fitting first company, our friends there always want us to remind you that if you're dedicated, if you're committed, you got to get fit. It's there's a full range of products. Don't just pull it out of a buddy's bag because he's saying, oh, here's the new hot driver. Like, go get yourself fit. There's all the range of club heads, but shaft offerings as well that they're going to pair you up and get you into. There's the 3 distinct GTS driver models and go to a precise fitting system, which is required by Titleist fitters that they get certified, and they're all specialists who are going to help you identify, the setup that is best to deliver you the most immediate benefit, but also consistent benefit for you and your game. So head on over to their driver selector tool, will get you started, and it'll take you to that fitting specialist near you at Titleist.com. All right, Professor, let's get on to the show.
Let's do it.
Xander Nethercutt, Captain Nethercutt, welcome to the Backdrop.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
We've been excited to chat with you, man. You're a fascinating dude, a passionate golfer. You belong on this podcast for a bunch of different reasons. Maybe selfishly, I'll start with you're our new captain of New Club in our oldest, most prestigious chapter. No offense to our Atlanta friends, but I wanted to just start there. You know, it's funny because we spend a lot of time explaining what New Club is not to a lot of folks, I think. You know, it's not the country club. It's not your men's league, your travel league. It's not a booking service, but members often they can feel when it's actually becoming that club, that different way to belong. And since you stepping into that role as captain, I've noticed more people feeling that way just because some of the little content pieces we put out with you and just your conversations and activity. But what are the little signs you think you look at that tell you, okay, you know, there's a good pulse here of Chicago New Club?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. You know, I was at a monthly medal on Sunday. I'm out at Oakbrook, and I don't know, there were, you know, however many guys there were, a couple dozen guys out there, and we got kind of it's a cloudy, rainy day at the beginning. But I wasn't playing particularly well, and yet, you know, as I watch the leaderboard kind of coming down the back nine, you know, I don't know, I see all these familiar names, all these guys, some of whom I expect to be there, others of whom, you know, I know have game and maybe hadn't been flashing it as much the last couple of years. There's one guy in particular, Andrew Luttrell, who was going, you know, pretty low, playing well. I know this guy has game, and I see it, you know, I see it start to play out in the scores. And, you know, after I finished, I knew I wasn't going to win the event, but I just felt compelled, you know, after I was standing in the parking lot to go back and watch these guys, these other guys that I know just come up 18 and see how they finished it off. And I think, you know, in golf, I don't know, there's this element of when you don't play well, sometimes you just want to get off the course and, you know, head home and sit on your couch and sulk about having shot in 82. But, you know, I got off the course and I shot in 82. And yet there I was, like, seeing this leaderboard, knowing that these are all guys that I care about, who I've built relationships with over the last couple of years. And I want to go, you know, see them finish up. And part of this, I will say, part of this was that Mark Colwell was also in contention. And I was like, guys, Mark Colwell absolutely cannot win the monthly medal. Like, someone's got to beat him. And so I go down, you know, at the end, I go watch David White get up and down from 40 yards to, you know, shoot a +6 and beat him. And that just, it kind of made my heart sing. You know, it was just one of those moments where it's this guy, you know, hits a big shot in a big moment in a monthly medal. And, you know, he comes off and I dap him up and we talk for a while, and I met a new member right there on 18. And it was just kind of this, it wasn't a huge deal, but it was just one of those moments where you're like, this is a cool thing. You know, these are guys that are excited to see each other, that see each other, you know, continually, not just once, but in kind of this ritualistic manner, whether it's at a monthly medal, whether it's at an event like the Stinger. And, you know, I think that's a lot of what a club is. It's consistency. You know, it's not anything flashy, but it's consistency. It's ritual. It's, you know, over and over. It's expecting to see the same guys. And so, yeah, I think Sunday illustrated for me, you know, the power of New Club. And it kind of reinvigorated me. It just got me excited to keep this whole thing going.
Yeah,
and to be captain.
Those check-ins, and, you know, I know you were a competitive golfer and in college, and it's one of those things where a lot of, I just think it's one of those things that was culturally lost in the transition from golf from the UK to here, is that it is a game and a sport, and you're intended to compete. And the cool part about it is that everybody fundamentally stinks at golf. You fail, you know, 99% of the time. But with handicaps, it can be equitable. And but tell me how you feel like competition, it's clear that it plays a role, but it's not the front seat. Like, what you're saying is you're still able to enjoy it after day. But how has that evolved for you as, you know, a one-day competitive golfer to now a competitive golfer, but also with other elements?
Well, yeah, I you know, it's interesting. You and I know we both think about, like, things from kind of almost like an anthropological first principles, like, you know, bottom up lens, like how did things emerge? And I think, you know, fundamentally, when you look at competition itself, just as an idea, competition is not, I don't think it's like inherently in our natures necessarily. I think rather, what's kind of in our natures as humans is to play and to just do things. And, I go back to with you, I think we were talking about how golf originally, it was just people like batting things around on a surface. And then eventually, maybe a ball rolled into a hole and it was like, oh, that's, we could make a game out of that. We could let's just try and do that. And then, competition would have naturally been downstream of that. That after you kind of start playing around and you just do things, then, it's like this human thing where it's like you see other people doing it and you're kind of like, maybe I'm better at that than them. It's like so competition is downstream of just this human impulse to kind of seek meaning and do things and just find a way to play and have fun. And I think part of the relationship that I struggled with golf for a long time was that it was almost like competition first, right? Where it was like in high school and college, you almost forget about the playful aspect of it, where it's like you're at the tournaments, it's these big events, stroke play, it's all this stuff, and it's just very serious and it's kind of nerve-wracking. And I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think New Club has really brought me back to this idea that, the competitions are fun because you kind of know the guys and, it's just guys you enjoy and it's a game you love. And when you're all in that mindset of just like, you just love playing for the sake of playing, you just love being out there, it's kind of a natural thing to be like, well, who's the best today? And it's just sort of a question you end up asking. And it can be, David White some days, it can be Andrew Luttrell other days, Mark Colwell, dare I say it, other days, sometimes it's me.
Sounds like it can't. Sounds like it can't be Mark Colwell, according to our captain.
Well, I would prefer it not be, but again, if he's the best some days, then he's the best. And so I think the best competitions tend to be downstream of a group that cares a lot about its members and knows each other really well. And that's when competition starts to feel really fun. And it doesn't make you want to win it any less. It actually makes you want to win it more. But if you don't win, or if you do, it matters because everyone cares. And I think you see the same thing in tour events where it was like, today it was his day. And, when guys see other guys win, they're genuinely excited. You have Justin Rose and Rory McIlroy on the 18th green at the Masters. And Justin Rose wants to win that so badly. But then Rory wins and, hats off. It was his day today. And, I'm happy for him. So I think, I don't know, it's that New Club. It's that blend of, it's that beginning with familiarity and the care and the love for the game, and then letting, the quality of the competition really emerge from that.
Poor Mark taking shots all throughout the beginning of this episode.
Hey, you gotta have an antagonist.
If anything,
in the story.
it's a testament to the quality of his game.
That's
He's
right.
Playing well.
Playing well.
Xander, some of our listeners are obviously New Club members or familiar with Scottish clubs, but a lot of them aren't. And so they hear the word captain and might not be familiar with what that means. So I'd like, from your perspective, one, what was your reaction when, approached on being the captain of the Chicago chapter of New Club? And then what is it that you see as your role within the golf club as captain?
Yeah, I think my first reaction was, surprise and, kind of this elation of feeling like I was recognized not only by Mark, but apparently by, my peers in the club, as Mark described, as someone who really stuck up for, the club's values and what New Club is supposed to be about and how golf is supposed to be played. So I felt very honored to have been spoken about like that. I mean, I've heard it said that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. And, and I think it was nice to know that someone had said something that elicited the reaction from Mark that, I could be captain when I wasn't in the room. So that was my first reaction to it. As far as my role, I think, to be honest, like I'm still figuring out exactly what it is and, trying to understand how I can best serve the club. I think there are a couple primary things that I've been trying to focus on. And, the first one is presence. And this is pretty easy, right? It's being at the events, it's communicating with members, it's introducing myself. And it's pretty easy. I mean, it's kind of, I think part of why it felt so natural is I already like to do these things. I like to go to the monthly medals. I like to go to the Stinger. I like to compete. I like to be out there. And I think Thomas Vangel said something to me. He's like, yeah, Xander, you add a lot to every event you're in. And it's because I get excited. I get fired up. If I make a big putt, like I'm going to celebrate. You're going to hear about it. And like, so it's just, I do think there's a bit of that fire that I like to think that I bring to those events. And I think you need some of that in a captain, just that excitement. So I think there's that. I think the other thing that I've been trying to focus on and I want to be doing more of is both engaging existing members and then, communicating and helping onboard new members. I think, New Club as a club, one of the strengths is the pure breadth of access that we have. There's so much great golf in these cities that we're in Northeast Ohio and Chicago and Atlanta. And, being a member at New Club, you really do get access to a lot of it, if not all of it, a lot of it. And that's a beautiful thing. But there also isn't, a physical club right off the bat where you can go and kind of learn through osmosis. And I think as captain, my role is to bridge a little bit of that gap. When guys join the club, to be not necessarily an employee of New Club, but someone who reaches out, welcomes you to the club, just says, hey, if you need anything, any questions you have, like, I'm here. And then obviously the reason we're all a part of this club fundamentally is because we love playing golf. And, just to offer, hey guys, we've got a Friday Skins game going this week. We've got a monthly medal coming up. I'm not sure if you know what a monthly medal is, but it's our monthly stroke play competition where we just see, who's playing the best that month. We've got the Stinger coming up. It's our member guests. It's a great event down at Flossmoor. Just explaining and, giving meaning to these events. Because I think as a member, it is easy to forget that when you joined, you didn't know any of these things. And so, I do see myself as that bridge between, really feeling like you're a member and joining and becoming a member. And so I think it's those two things. It's the presence, and then it's engaging with existing members and bringing on, new members and really making them feel like they're a part of the club.
You do it really well, Xander. So we're honored that you're our captain, man, for Chicago. I've always felt a kinship with you because, you see a guy who's former college golfer in sales, different tech companies in your career, and maybe prone to discussions around anthropology and sociology. As I saw a lot of myself in you when we first met, and just was like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is what, he'll do well within the New Club environment from my experience, right? And then I hear you're writing a book. So I figured you said yes to being our captain because you're like, sure, I got nothing else going on. No, he was writing a book when he agreed to be our captain, and in your first book. And so honestly, I had to say, like, how did that happen? I was, and we got to catch up a little bit down at Sweetens Cove for our spring meeting, and so I went and read your original essay that caught the attention from Ron Johnson. I think the Luxury Network, which we'll include in the show notes just as a precursor to the book, which is Shop Different, How Retail Revealed Apple's Genius. But I'll summarize quickly what I took from it. The headline of, Apple is this incredible luxury network, and the stores are part church, they're part theater, they're part exclusivity, being a part of this subset of society in this, really machine-like way that's going to make your life better. And I'm just curious, what do you think or know caught Ron's attention with that piece? Because it went viral, and the guy that was responsible for all those stores, it sounds like, took the most interest. Like, what made him want to know you and or know who wrote it, and maybe give us a little background on that story?
Yeah, I can't say for sure from Ron's perspective what it would have been. The interesting thing about that essay, so I published it in 2017. A lot of what I wrote in that essay, I don't agree with anymore. It's I think that's sort of the joy of writing, is that you do grapple with your thinking. But again, the quality of your thinking is fundamentally based on the information that you have at any given moment. And as you get more information and you mature and you get older, you look back on your old thinking, you're like, well, based on what I knew at the time, yeah, that was correct. But as you get older and you learn more things, you look back like, wow, that was actually really immature. Like I was kind of taking a narrow look at something that actually there's much more to it. And
by the way, I feel like there's a hilarious comedic version of all this where it's like you write it, you're working in tech sales in Chicago, which is always hilarious. Those years I reflect on for me, and you write it, you publish it, and then the guy behind the Apple store wants to talk. Like that's hilarious to me. I'm sorry, probably terrifying too, right?
A little bit. Yeah. I mean, the story itself is interesting. If you want me to kind of go into, how, what the story is behind the book, because I wrote the essay in 2017. I published it while I was on a trip with my dad to Rwanda, of all places. And so I want to say I was like 9 or 10 hours ahead of like being in the US. And I just remember like I would wake up at like odd hours in the night and I would check my notifications and there'd just be hundreds, of notifications. There's just people commenting and, blowing it up. And that can be addictive, as someone who spends also, professor, maybe a little too much time on Instagram, you do get addicted to that drip of, those notifications. And there was a lot coming through. And anyway, that was 2017. A lot of people read the essay. And then, yeah, 6 years went by after I had published that, and I published a few more essays. I stopped writing in 2020, which is weird because you'd think the pandemic, like it'd be a pretty good time just to sit in your room and write. But I think as the world ground to a halt, things just sort of stopped happening, and I stopped being inspired. It just kind of stopped. After that, I went and worked in a couple other sales jobs for a few more years. I was, one of the many tech layoffs that happened at the end of 2022. And from the end of 2022 to early 2023, I kind of languished. I wasn't doing particularly well. And I don't know if you know this story, Matt, but actually, I think in like March, it must have been like February or March of 2023, just deciding that I needed to figure out, I needed some sort of structure to start like what it felt like rebuilding my life and kind of getting my shit together, so to speak. I joined Smart Golf over in, I think it's in Bricktown. And I started working with a golf coach, and I had qualified for the Illinois State Amateur the year before. And so I kind of had designs on like, I want to get back there. I want to, I qualified last year. I'd like to contend this year. And it added this, it just getting back into like a gym and starting to work towards a goal it just got me into a mental space where the world looked brighter. There was suddenly something to work towards, something to start giving my life a little bit of meaning again. And it was around that same time, I think, and it might have been like May, that I decided, not because it was a huge problem for me, but it was just kind of something that was lingering, that I was going to get sober. I was going to stop drinking alcohol. And so I got sober. And then a week later, I was out at Flossmoor with a new club member at an event. And I was on, I don't know, like the 7th or 8th hole. And I got a message, of all places, on Facebook from someone saying, hey, I read your essay, The Luxury Network. This is the one that was published 6 years ago. And I actually know the guy who created the Apple Store, Ron Johnson. And I'm going to send it to him and, see what he thinks. And I've gotten a few messages on, different platforms over the years about things I've written. Facebook is kind of a especially weird place to get a message because it's 2023 and I just don't know, who uses Facebook really. But, I got the message. I didn't reply to it. I saw it. I went back to playing my round of golf. Then a week later, I got another message, and it was looping me in with this guy who created the Apple Store, Ron Johnson. I remember when I got the original message, it was like, yeah, I'm gonna send it to the guy who created the Apple Store. And I was like, Steve Jobs created the Apple Store. Like, what are you talking about? That unless he's, unless what happened in 2011 didn't happen, I'm pretty sure he's not with us anymore. But anyway, so I got that second message. I also think I ignored that. And then I got a third message like a week after that. And this one I think was from Ron. And he must have been stalking me on Instagram, or, just he must have seen my Instagram, because he said, hey, Xander, I see you're in Chicago and that you're a golfer. Would you like to join me for a round of golf? And we could talk about, potentially working together. And again, at this point, I'm not employed. I've kind of been trying to like look for a way back into writing. I've just gotten sober. And I just remember like I was standing like in my apartment and I just like looked up at the sky and I was like, this is weird. Like something's going on. It kind of felt like there was some higher power. Again, I don't know where I stand on all that stuff, but it felt like there was some sort of higher power looking over me, sort of guiding the moment. And again, the coincidences just kept lining up. I mean, the guy lived in Atherton in California. I'm from San Rafael, which is about an hour and 20 minutes north. And I was actually going to be back in California. He was like, yeah, are you ever out in California? I was like, dude, I'm literally going to be out in California next week for the 4th of July. And
Amazing.
I was coming out and he was like, well, why don't you just come down? We'll play a round of golf. We'll get to know each other a little bit and, we'll just chat. And so anyway, so I met him, a week later at his club, Menlo Country Club in Menlo Park, I think, California, which is about, 15 minutes away from where my grandmother lives. I mean, just in an area that I'm just intimately familiar with. And we met in his parking lot.
And your game's in good shape at this point because you just, went through your physical training and indoor sessions.
Dude,
right?
Smart Golf deserves so much credit for this. Shout out to them.
Shout out
You know,
Smart Cop. I had similar
Marissa,
experience with them.
they're great. Yeah. Kyle Pecco was helping me out. Marissa Campo was my trainer. You know, she was getting me in shape. I remember doing the like Scotty Scheffler, you know, twists and telling her that it was hurting my back. And then she'd find some other way to do, you know, it was a lot of creativity. It was good stuff. And yeah, so I got there and my game was in good shape, but I was a little nervous. I think I was like 5 over through the first 4 holes, and then I righted the ship. And I think I ended up shooting 76 and actually beating Ron in that first round, which luckily he didn't hold against me because everyone was like, "Are you going to let him beat you?" I was like, "No, I'm not going to let him beat me. Like this guy founded the Apple Store. He's a competitor. Like I'm, you know, we're going to go out. We're going to do battle." Anyway, and so we just started talking, and you know, he wasn't really sure he wanted to write a book. It turns out he'd been toying with the idea. I think for him, there was an element of he left Apple in 2011 and he said to me, he was like, yeah, you know, after I left, he was like, I told myself if I did, you know, everyone told me to write a book. And he's like, I told myself if I did, I would wait probably 10 years or so before I actually did it. You know, I'd really want to digest it. He said the same thing, I think, about the Steve Jobs book that came out, Walter Isaacson's book. He's like, I don't want to read it right when it comes out. He's like, I'm going to take 10 years, you know, let myself digest the experience and then I'll come back to it. And so I caught him, you know, 11, 12 years after he had left Apple. And so it was a little bit faded. Like he had taken the time really to digest the experience. He also had an experience after Apple where he went and he was CEO of JCPenney for a couple of years. And for as well as everything that he had done previously in his career went, he'd been at Target for 10 years before Apple. He was at Apple for obviously 12 years, you know, creating and leading the Apple Store. JCPenney did not go particularly well. And there are obviously a lot of reasons for that, you know, a number of reasons. But, you know, as Ron said to me, he's like, you know, if we're going to talk about this in the book, you know, I just want to own my mistakes, the things that I did, you know, the mistakes that I made. And, you know, so we started talking and Ron started just reaching out to me every couple days and would just share, you know, some little tidbit and just ask me how things were going. And I think what we basically ended up agreeing to through all those conversations was Xander, why don't you write a chapter and then, you know, we can see what that looks like. And so I ended up writing a chapter, which he loved. And then we put together kind of a preliminary agreement for how we were going to write the book. And originally, I'm going on and on. I hope you guys are, you know, okay with me just sharing the story.
I love the writing process. Keep going.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's so originally, you know, he had said, look, I'm not 100% sure I want to write a me story. You know, I don't know if I want this to be a Ron Johnson's at the center of the story. I was like, well, what do you want to do? And he's like, I don't know. I think it'd be some sort of like lessons learned type of book. You know, I think I'd rather have it be maybe like if it was my story, then I'd do a lessons learned book. You know, if it wasn't my story, then maybe you could write it about me. And I've never been the type of guy who likes to be told what to do. And I think when you're never the type of person who likes to be told what to do, the natural like corollary to that is you don't tend to love to tell other people what to do. And a lessons book always felt to me a little bit like we were just telling people what to do and what to think. And the more I spoke to Ron, it was just clear to me that he wasn't that guy. You know, I think what great leaders really do, and Matt, I see this in you, you know, great leaders, they do things, but they light fires in other people. You know, they inspire other people to think for themselves. And I think that's what Ron does. And so it was very clear to me from the beginning. It was like, if we're going to do this, whether I'm the one writing it or whether Ron is the one writing it, we're telling this as a story. We're going to share it as your story. You have an incredible personal journey, you know, from growing up in Minnesota, going to Harvard Business School, deciding, you know, you had an offer at Goldman Sachs, but you decided to forego the offer at Goldman and go work in retail of all places. And not just retail, you know, not retail headquarters, but retail in the stockroom. You know, in 1984, Ron went and he went to Mervyn's in California, which I don't know if either of you guys remember Mervyn's, but, you know, this little Southwest kind of mid-tier department store chain that was a really hot subsidiary of the Minnesota-based Dayton Hudson Corporation in the 1980s. And so Ron went there and he worked for 6 months in the stockroom and trained and cut his teeth and really got to know every aspect of the retail business. He was ringing on registers, you know, scraping gum off the floors, all this stuff. And then in the late 80s, I think in 89, he went back to Target. And then, you know, he was at Target for 10 years. And then that really gave him the chance to go to Apple. And then Apple, he created what is argued, you know, it's not really a debate. It's the most successful retail concept in history. But again, the story is as much a business story as it is a personal, you know, story of how do the things we create also create us? How do the things we shape also shape us? And, what beliefs do they instill in us? And I think there was an element which we explore in the book a lot of how, Ron's time at Apple really gave him a level of confidence that I think he would describe as bordering on arrogance. He's not an arrogant guy, but it was sort of the situational arrogance of, I can go anywhere and fix anything. And obviously, I think when you get to the top of the game in any game, whether it's golf or whether it's retail, the only thing that wakes you up in the morning is the next big challenge, something bigger. And I think the idea of reinventing the department store, where this guy grew up 2 miles from the department store, from the very first indoor mall in the world, and like the Dayton's department store in Minneapolis. I mean, it felt like fate to him, right? It felt like, I was born to do this. I walked through department stores with my brother as a kid. My brother used to sing Christmas carols going up and down the escalators in the Dayton's department store. He's like, I genuinely feel like I'm being called to do this. And you can see why. And you feel that in the story. And so, to me, I don't know, as I'm describing it, I get excited talking about it. And so the idea of like a lessons book, when we have that story to tell, is like, no, we're not going to do a lessons book. We're going to tell the story, of your personal journey and, let people find in that story what they will. And so I pitched him on that narrative. And originally, I think I pitched him on, let's open with you. I think Christopher Nolan does this a lot, and I've heard it said that great stories often start in the middle, or at least kind of towards the end, and they hook you with like a moment, and then they drop you back. Record scratch. You're back at the beginning, and we did end up sort of doing that. But I think the way that I pitched Ron on it originally was like, dude, if we're gonna do JCPenney, let's lean into it. Let's open with it. Let's start with that. That is the moment. And this is another lesson from Ron. I think he said when he talked about the Genius Bar and support in the Apple Store. He said, when you're in doubt about something, either leave it out or stick it out. Mm-hmm. And that was the thought, with the Genius. I say that with the Genius Bar, where it was like most computer stores when they were developing the Genius Bar, it was either let's not have support at all, which was what most computer stores did. And Ron was like, no, it's like, well, we can either leave it out or we can really make it the primary feature of the store. And that's what they at Apple did. Is like, we're going to make support and service the primary thing that we focus on in this store. This idea that you can come in and get served. And so that was my thought with JCPenney of like, well, let's either, if we're going to do it, we got to do it, or we don't. We don't have it at all. And my instinct as someone who just loves rise and fall stories and just human stories was like, let's make it a big part of the story. And so I pitched him on that. And he was, to his credit, he was very open. He's such a humble guy, which can be surprising, I think, for leaders and CEO types. He's an incredibly humble, grounded guy. And so we started with that, of me writing the book about him. And I got a few chapters in, we were developing a proposal. I was flying by the seat of my pants, calling every friend I knew who was like sort of in the writing industry, trying to figure out like, dude, how the hell do we do this? Do we need an agent? It's like, no, get a proposal, then get an agent. It's just it was totally, fly by the seat of your pants. And Ron was a great partner, just like, well, how can I help? All this stuff. And then I think it was in December that I got dinner with a couple of family friends, and I had written a few chapters about Ron, trying to tell the story in my voice. And I was explaining to him, the family friends, it was this dinner, and I was explaining to them what I was doing, and I was all excited about it. And I think as I spoke about Ron, and like, he's a big deal. He's founder of the Apple Store, worked directly with Steve Jobs. I think it kind of hit this guy that I was talking to. He just kind of had this question. He's like, Xander, he's like, all this is great, dude. He's like, it's an amazing story. I mean, Ron sounds like such an interesting guy. I'm sure this book is going to be fantastic. He's like, I really just have one question for you. I was like, what's the question? He's like, why the hell are you writing it? And I kind of sat there, and it was one of those questions. It was kind of like one of those questions. It's like writing, where it's like all of a sudden, writing. I've heard a great quote about writing, which is writing is, it's the act of overhearing yourself say things that you didn't know you knew. And it's such a beautiful way to think about it. I'm going to say it again, because I think it's really, writing is the act of overhearing yourself say things that you didn't know you knew.
Yeah.
And when he said that, I wasn't writing, but like it was, writing is a conversation with yourself. And I think in that conversation with him, I heard something that I knew, but I didn't really know to that point that I knew, which is like, I have no business being the one writing this book. I don't. And so that planted the seed in my imagination. Is like, well, what if I went back to Ron and said, hey, dude, I have a proposal for you, which is, I just think this is your story, and I think you should tell it. I think you should be the one telling it. And I'd be happy to ghostwrite it for you. I've never done this, but like I'd be happy to ghostwrite it for you. I'd like to explore that. And Ron, again, very open guy, was like, Xander, if you think that's the better way to do it, let's do it. And you can write a chapter instead of writing a chapter about me in the stories. Like, why don't you try writing a chapter in my voice? And that was liberating, and it was also circumstantially the circumstances lined up, because my intuition was, after hearing about everything Ron did in the Apple Store, that so much of his personal story, again, we are the result of all we have met, right? Of all the things that have happened to us. And so what I'd really been trying to do for the first couple months that Ron and I had been working together was unpack the early years, unpack his relationship with his mom, with his dad, these unconditionally loving relationships, unpack the relationships he had with his siblings, understand not only the place where he grew up, but also the time in which he grew up, what relationships were like with, what adults' relationships were like with politicians, with community, with these ideas of service, all these things that came out in the Apple Store, to really tie that together for the readers so they could understand that, as much as Apple retail was a business decision, it was also a very personal journey and a personal expression of who Ron was as a person coming out through a business initiative. And so when I got to, having talked about that with him all through the end of 2023, by the time I got to January and I said, I was saying, it's, I'm going to write this in your voice, I really had a good scaffolding for what his childhood was like and what it would be like to write from his perspective. And it wasn't intentional. It was just, we talked about it so much, I just kind of knew. And so I sat down, and I remember where I was. I pulled out my laptop, I made my coffee, and I just sat at my kitchen table for 30 minutes in the morning, and I just wrote out the first chapter. I think we titled it In the Beginning. Ron's he's a Christian man, a man of faith, and so it was In the Beginning, and that was the first chapter. And it was his childhood, and it was about his parents, and it was connecting retail to all that. And, obviously the drafts would change, but I sent that to him, and I think the text I got back was just wow in all caps. Yeah. And it just clicked. It was like, this is the only way to do it. And Steve Jobs used to say that. He would say, if you work hard enough at something, you'll reveal the inevitable way that it had to be done, and everyone will agree it couldn't have been done any other way. And it was months of trying to figure out all the wrong ways to do this that it just clicked. It was like, this is a story. It starts at the beginning, with this childhood story, and it's in Ron's voice. And that was the moment that it flipped from being me, writing Ron's story, to me, ghostwriting for Ron, and the book would really be in his voice. And so from there, it progressed, and I'm happy to keep going, with the story. But
I do want to follow up. It's so apparent, Dinner, how much your time with Ron has just shaped you, and how I can see in your excitement how much you learned from him. And so I want to go back to something you alluded to, that you wrote this 2017 piece that led to all of this, and Apple being a luxury brand, but you snuck in there. Your time with Ron sort of changed your thinking on that, or like you read it now and you're like, I disagree that. I wonder if you could talk us through that shift. One, maybe start with like what you meant when you called him a luxury brand, and what did you learn through that journey with Ron and telling the story that now you look at it and you're like, you know what, maybe I was partially correct, but I think about this differently now.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've thought a lot about this, and I've also thought not nearly enough about it. So forgive me if this is a bit rambling. It's the thoughts are not yet formed, but I have sort of the idea of what I want to say here. And yeah, I
That's
think
like our podcast entirely, Xander. We don't have, all we have is an idea. Cook, baby.
Yeah,
you mean we don't all have it figured out? Yeah,
your thinking is always just your present self, right? It's just your present self, and you can revise down the road.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Conversation is my, speaking is my act of processing what I'm thinking. Don't listen to what I say. Anyway. Yeah. So it was a 2017 essay. But again, as I've always kind of said this about writing, that writing was, I came to writing in kind of a weird way. I didn't study English in college, which a lot of people expect, because Kenyon is it's known for its English program. There are a lot of really fantastic writers that have come out of Kenyon. Everyone who I knew, I knew so many amazing writers at Kenyon, and just incredible communicators. I did take a creative writing course at Kenyon, and I did a lot of writing in other classes. So I was writing a lot, but I wasn't really learning about the act of writing, which I think was a good thing, because I think when you approach something in a more playful way, in a way that's just sort of fun, and you're not so bound by like reading all of the best things that have ever been written and like listening to classmates say things that you could never even imagine coming out of your own mouth, you don't get intimidated in the same way, and you're not afraid of not being enough. And so I do wonder what would have happened if I had studied English. I mean, maybe I would have done something completely different. But I think I was very lucky that I didn't actually study it, and that I found writing almost as a necessity as opposed to something that I study. I mean, I found writing because it was a way to help me express my own thinking. And I'm getting to where I want to go with the Apple stuff, but writing really became a way. You know, I like to read, and I was reading a lot of stuff after school. And I think one of the things I read was a book from Scott Galloway, the NYU Stern professor, who was talking about the Apple stores. And he talked a lot about Apple as a luxury brand. And it was pretty clear, I think, in like the 2015, 2016, 2017 era, that that's what they were becoming. Because you look at what they were doing with the Apple Watch and their partnerships with like Hermes, and their ads were no longer on billboards, but rather in like magazines and like Vogue, and like these places where it was very clear that they were targeting a higher end market with these products. And Apple has shifted, I think, a little away from that now. But it was very clear that was at least in the zeitgeist of their thinking, was that we're trying to go upscale a little bit. And he said something too about the stores. And so I don't think it, honestly, when I look back on that essay, I'm not even sure it was that, original of thinking. It was more just looking at, what the Apple stores had become, and the fact that they were so beautiful, and they really felt like churches, and just the way they were built, and their use of light, and the incredible products. And I wrote about that, but what I realized as I worked with Ron, I mean, again, this was 2015, 2016, and what I realized when I was working with Ron is that he was there from 2000 to 2011, end of 2011, and if you look at Apple as a brand and how beautiful the stores became, and how incredible these incredible spaces around the world, you can really see that Apple wasn't always that company. Apple wasn't always the one developing these incredible spaces around the world. At first they were actually kind of modest almost. And so you go back to the beginning, and when they first began developing the store, the question for Steve Jobs was, well, what's going to be our differentiator? What's going to be the thing that differentiates us from the other resellers in the market? And I'm sorry, Matt, I'm going to back up here a little bit, because I think the story is relevant of really why Apple opened stores, to get at kind of what I'm trying to say about the essay itself.
Yeah, please.
The history on Apple is kind of important to understand. So Steve Jobs founded Apple in 1976. The company went public in 1980. Through obviously the next couple of years, they developed, the Macintosh, and then they launched that. And there's the iconic 1984 ad. But at the time, Steve was he was an immature leader, and a lot of people have said this, and I think he said it about himself. He didn't know, he didn't know what he didn't know. He was being brash and kind of hard to work with. And in 1985, that led to him effectively being forced out of Apple. So he left Apple in 1985. After he left Apple, he founded two companies. Founded might be the wrong word for Pixar, but he founded Next, which did a high-end computer for the education market. And then he founded Pixar, which obviously we all know. And a lot of people don't know that he founded Pixar, but he did. And then in 1996, Apple was on its third CEO since Steve had left. The company was struggling. They weren't doing particularly well. And the then CEO of Apple, Gil Amelio, who was a former board member and had been the CEO of National Semiconductor, purchased Next for, I think it was $120 million, with the goal of bringing the people from Next back, where there's some really talented software engineers that he wanted back at the company. But also they had a software system that promised to help Gil Amelio deliver, I think, on a promise that he had made, about, implementing some new software that would overhaul the internal architecture of the Mac. Or I don't know all the details. The important thing is Steve was back at Apple as of early 1997 or sometime around then. And then maybe it's not surprising that within the next couple months, he eventually ascended to CEO. Gil Amelio was out. But the interesting thing that a lot of people forget, Steve actually, he didn't take on the full CEO title immediately. He took on he called himself the interim CEO. And a lot of people have since theorized that he took on the interim title because he didn't know if Apple could be saved. And which is, again, it's kind of normal. It's like, I'm not sure. I already was ousted from this company once. I'm trying to defend myself a little bit from the pain of like, if it fails again, I mean, that's, that'd be hard. It'd be hard for anyone to deal with. And so he's interim CEO of Apple as of 1997. In August 1998, they launched the Bondi Blue iMac, the egg-shaped, really design-focused computer. And it sells pretty well, but mostly to the Apple faithful, mostly to the people who already knew what Apple was, who already loved Apple. And it was at that moment that Steve had that realization. He's like, I don't think the problem is the product. The product is great. He's like, what I think the problem is the way that we're communicating with our customers. And if you look at where Apple was selling, it's not hard to understand this. I mean, their go-to-market strategy at the time was largely through retailers, small mom and pop tech shops that were doing their best, but just weren't, equipped to, probably articulate the Mac's value proposition and why it was so much more expensive. And then you had CompUSA, and they were even selling it in Sears, which is insane to think about. They were selling the Mac in Sears. And so Steve had that realization as of early 1999 that if Apple was going to win, they needed to own the way they were going to market. They needed to own their customer experience. And that led him to, I need a retail guy. And so in early 1999, he began interviewing candidates. And one of the candidates he brought in was Ron, who had spent the last decade at Target and had just recently launched a line of designer home goods, whose handle, actually the shape of the handle, was inspired by the same figure that inspired the design of the Mac, which was the egg. And it's the shape that fits everyone's hand. And so there was this interesting synergy between, the two of them, that they both were design focused. Even though the hilarious thing is, when they first met in November of 1999, after discussing all this stuff about the store, Steve asked, Ron, can you just send me an email on all this stuff? And Ron goes, I've never sent an email, dude. Like, I don't even have a computer. And so he's at the end of that call with, at the end of that interview, and, he doesn't even have a computer. And so it really shows how different the two worlds that they were in were. But anyway, so
I'm so jealous of that
short,
life. Without an email, without a computer. I just want to give that a shot.
Can you imagine?
I know. I've never lived that life.
I think a lot of us do. It's Power New Club, right? Get out there, get off the phone.
That's right. I think I got a birth certificate and an email address when I was born. I don't know if I've lived without it, but no,
yeah,
I mean, Xander, there's so much to that, and I can see you're getting closer to like what changed. Well, a heck of a lot of information, and the actual story changed, and what this was, was really about. I'm just curious. There's the things you're tossing around here. We're talking about not as many might know Ron Johnson, but everybody knows Steve Jobs. Everyone knows Apple. Life has been changed considerably by that. And obviously your book is about Ron having a massive, massive impact on that. I'm curious, when you're dealing with these, I don't know if we call them like the mythology of it. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I mythologize Apple, and I try to learn from everything they've done. And when you're doing that, or writing on a topic such as this, is every line, like, it probably feels a little bit like there's so much gravity to every line that you are, there's going to be the Apple faithful, as you said, are going to be looking at this. And I guess for the mission of your book, for telling Ron's story, how did you decide which details are actually something that explain what took place, and which details are just kind of like the fun anecdote that aren't at the heart of it? Do you know what I'm saying? Because I feel like we all have an anecdote about Apple, and you probably have, you yourself now probably have millions. But how do you decide like which ones are relevant to the story and which ones are just the kind of shiny ones?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and the only way I can really describe it, I think Jerry Seinfeld said something about this. I'm not comparing myself to Seinfeld, but I do think the writing, he speaks well about the writing process, which is when he talked about writing Seinfeld. He's like, look, the reason it was good is because we just locked ourselves in a room and we just worked on it for hours and hours and hours, and it was just all we talked about. And again, I hope that people think the book is good. I hope that they enjoy it. I don't know what the reaction is going to be. I can tell you I've worked really hard on it, and I'm really hopeful that people love it, obviously. But once it's out, and that's its own thing. But, here it was really useful to have the creative partner I had in Ron, because, I would write, And then I would share it with him. And sometimes he would like rewrite a little bit of a section or something. And then he'd send it back to me. And then we'd be on the phone. And, basically every single day, often multiple times a day for 3 years. And I don't think most people ever have I ever have even a relationship like that. I mean, that's kind of like what a marriage is almost, right? Where it's like you're just talking all the time about this one particular thing. And it gets to the point that you know every sentence, you know every word in the document. And Ron, I don't think all authors like Ron have the time or the willingness to invest the level of time that he did into this project. But the way that we figured out like what sentences needed to be there and what sentences didn't was just by me, writing it and just seeing like that doesn't fit. You hear it in your own head and you can just hear that's superfluous. I've said that before. But it was also just talking with Ron all the time and and just revealing like, hey, maybe that's not relevant, maybe that is relevant. And I'm not going to sit here and say we got it all right. I think in fact we got a lot of stuff wrong. I mean, I go back through the manuscript and there's plenty of times where I'm like, damn, I know we cut something here and I wish we could put it back, but it's too late. And that's kind of the imperfection. The imperfection is the beauty of it, of like there used to be something here that's not, and like I know the reader doesn't know. But I really think that's the only way to create something great is you just you do it, you talk about it constantly all the time. It's it is your baby, it's your sole focus, and it's the only way to really create great work.
That really answers one of my other questions for you, which was you're off writing your first book, but Ron's also telling the story, right? And I was like, how did he? That seems like a huge challenge, like a strange challenge, almost in a way for any writer. And I was like, how did he grapple with that? It sounds like through daily communication. So it was almost that you were viscerally experiencing it through Ron, so that it probably almost felt natural at some.
Yeah, I mean, it felt very natural. And again, he's just a good guy. We're not like most of the time we're not even talking about the book. He's just calling me like, hey, he's a golfer. So it's like, hi, he's like, I got a master's pool this weekend. Who you got? We're talking about other things. We really developed like a friendship that was kind of adjacent to the book, running parallel alongside it. But it just made it very easy to talk about, oh yeah, by the way, I had this thought on this sentence. And, and then when you talk about like the sentences or like some idea, then that gives way to like, well, actually that kind of reminds me of like, we could market it this way. Actually that person would be a good person to speak to, about like this specific idea. Again, I use, the subtitle is How Retail Revealed Apple's Genius. But what that title really could be was just like how action revealed thinking. I think that's just the truth is that, when you take action towards any sort of goal, you really, it forces your brain to think and it creates ideas in your head that then lead to like new different things you can do. And so I think, marketing and all these things are really downstream of just like action and
that
ideas.
Resonates so viscerally with my experiences of you can sit all day long in that room, as Seinfeld might said, and work on it. But the work is actually the action of putting it out in the world. When it deals with services or products, like until it's that interaction with whether it's a customer or a partner or whatever, the idea is never going to really refine. It's not going to refine. It needs that pressure. And so much of human existence is resisting that pressure of like, it's not ready. But yeah, that I could see that. That's such a great lesson for anybody, I think.
No, you need the pressure. And I actually, I think that as humans, we think that we want to escape pressure, but I actually think the opposite is true. I think we want to be under like the right kind of pressure. I think pressure, when you think about like what pressure actually is, what does the word mean? It's like pressure is synonymous with weight, right? It feels like weight. And I think when we use weight, we use weight to describe like meaning. It's like if something's meaningful to us, it carries weight for us. And I think, I felt that way when I was out, on the last 9 holes at the club championship, last year. It's like pressure is a privilege. It's a demonstration that something matters to you, that it means something to you, and that it carries weight for you. And so when you're feeling that pressure, don't, I don't know, I don't try and escape it. You just have to sit with it and enjoy it and try and relish it. And, again, I think it ties in well with like the lesson too of, Apple versus JC Penney, because I think one of the interesting things you grapple with as a ghostwriter and as an author too, when you write a book, is that your memory is just not perfect. Our memories are weird things. They're very self-serving. They usually help, like, as a golfer, it helps to forget all your bad shots, right? You only remember the good ones, and so you don't, oftentimes the picture you have of the past is just not reality. And so one of the things that you have to do as a ghostwriter is not only speak to your subject, but also speak to the people who knew him well. And honestly, I would have liked to have done even more of that than I did. But you go back and you talk to these people, and they, will help paint a picture. And in this case, it was often a very different picture than the one Ron remembered. He's like, yeah, I think we did that in like 2004, 2005. And they're like, no, that wasn't until 2010. Or like, he's like, yeah, we were doing that from the beginning. I was like, no, like we weren't. Like, it was actually something that happened very late. And I think part of the reason I was so interested by that imperfection of memory is because I do think it had an impact on how Ron looked at J.C. Penney. And, when he got there, he had this option. It was like, well, we can either wait a year. Usually retailers launch big overhauls at the beginning of a year. And he'd gotten there in November of 2011. And they said, we can either do it, we can rush this out in February 2012, or we can wait a year. And, the conversation Ron had with the board, everyone was like, well, what do we have to lose? JCPenney's, it's not doing very well. Like, let's just go now. And Ron, first time CEO and probably, pretty humble guy. So like, okay, sure. Like, let's go now. I like, we'll figure it out. Ron is the type of guy who has always leaned into that immediate pressure. But there is that balance of like, you do need the pressure, but you also need to be able to go slow enough that it doesn't break you right at the beginning. And, I think Ron would say if he had taken that extra year to kind of shore up JCPenney's balance sheet, get the relationships with vendors in the right place, do a couple other things. Maybe he tried to eliminate all discounts. If he had gone a little bit slower on that, it might have gone better. But I think that's the impossible question for the leaders is like, we know we need the pressure of the market. We know we need to see how people are going to react to this and then iterate on it. But we also need to go, slow enough that pressure just doesn't break us completely. And that is, it's just not one of those questions that anyone else can answer for you. And I'm sure you deal with this as a CEO. You have to feel that balance. It's your job as a leader to sort of sit there and be like, what's too fast and what's too slow? And be willing to sit with the fact that, like, if you go, whatever you do, there's going to be things that break. There's going to be things that happen that, just that you are just not prepared for. And it's part of why, again, it's also part of why I resisted writing a lessons book. It's like, maybe that's a lesson, but I think, the most important thing you can do most important, I think, was it Aristotle or Socrates was like, I cannot teach anyone anything. I can only make them think. And I think that's true, and that's what I hope this story does, is it inspires people to recognize, like, no one can tell you how to do it. You just have to do it, and you have to feel it, and you have to be in it, and you have to be willing to embrace that pressure. And then it really ties in, I think, with this lesson at the end of the book, which Ron was, he's preached to me from the beginning, and not just preached, but not really preached even. It's more embodied, this idea of, treating people with kindness. He's a Christian man, man of faith, and kindness is a big thing for him. And I think that, in a culture of kindness, the pressure is not crushing. If you treat people with kindness and respect, and you understand that people are trying to figure things out, it allows the truth to breathe, which is that innovation and doing anything hard takes time and a lot of trial and error and a lot of failure. And, if we come at it from the perspective of, everyone's trying their best, let's be supportive and let's be kind. I think not everything works out, but I think, in general, things are better. And I do like to think that that's maybe part of the reason why I was elected captain. Because I remember, with New Club, look, there's a lot of great things about New Club. There's also some stuff that's not as great about New Club and things that are, you guys are working to improve every day. And I think I was out at some event and, at the Green with a couple guys, and I heard someone talking about, like, kind of complaining about like this, and this. And I just sort of said, I was like, dude, well, what's the solution? Like, let's try and figure it out. Like, we know this isn't perfect, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about how it could be better, and I think that's maybe part of what's missing from a lot of the discourse today is, it's very easy to talk about how bad things are. It takes kind of a visionary leader to say, like, here's how it can be better. Here's where we're going, here, and really paint a picture of, like, where are we headed? And, what does a better future actually look like? Anyway, I go on and on about that, about like AI and stuff.
Well, exactly. And something that you mentioned throughout with Ron and Apple is there is this there's no shortage of ideas, and there will always be critiques and criticisms, and even inside JCPenney with that element of the story. But the great leaders not only, I think, embodied that visionary leadership and had that image that people could see, they knew what to take good ideas, but to match them up with timing and phase them into a sequence. Because I think I've learned that it's like, man, you can take a really great idea, but put it either 3 steps too early or 4 steps too late, and it's trash. And it actually, hurts the experience. And so that's really a synthesizing that's difficult for the human mind, I think many times, is to understand it in the context of time and the situation and regional differences, maybe in the retail world. That's fascinating. It sounds like you just picked up on a ton of that in the book. I did want to give you an opportunity back to the book. You mentioned cutting things and the process of that and how difficult. Is there a story that you loved? Because obviously we want people to pick up your book and get your full rundown. And I'm sure there's plenty of great stories in there. But is there a story that you loved that just had to come out of the book? And did cutting it, where you sit now with the final product on shelves, do you still feel it made it better? And do you want to share it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a number I could, probably speak to. I think the ones that really strike me, it's not really like a story per se. It's just I don't know. You trim a couple. You say 3. If you have 3 different little anecdotes that support the same idea, oftentimes it's like, why don't you cut these 2? You don't necessarily. You've made the point. You don't need to belabor it. And I think one of the biggest themes of the story is, you look at a lot of leaders. I think in the way people talk about a lot of leaders, whether or athletes or anyone, and there's a lot of like people who are motivated by like pain or spite, or just like I didn't like my dad very much, and so I went and did this because I really didn't, I just wanted to spite him, and there's stories, and I'm sure that's true in a lot of cases. It's a very powerful motivator. I think spite is. And I honestly, I was searching for that with Ron a little bit early on. I was trying to understand. I was like, where's the pain, dude? Where did you really feel? What was the thing that happened to you in your childhood that was like, I need to go achieve and do something great, thinking that it could really only be something that was like, I was slighted, or I was, a girl made me feel stupid or something like that. But the reality, the more I spoke to him, his very first memory, and this does make it into the book, his very first memory is, I think he was 4 years old, and he's in Minnesota, and he's walking to, kind of makes me cry to even talk about it. He's walking to Cornelia Elementary with his mom down the street from his house, and he's going there to interview to see if he can start school a year early. And he walks into the principal's office with his mom, and the principal says, what color was George Washington's white horse? And Ron looks at the principal, and he looks at his mom, and he looks back at the principal, and he goes, black. And it was just one of those moments, I was like, he obviously was the wrong answer. So anyway, and then you cut, he walks out of the room, and he says, my first memory was I walked out of the room with my mom, and she kneeled me down outside, and she looked at me right in the eyes, and she says, Ronnie, no matter what happens, I will always love you. And it was just this it feels kind of like almost Pollyanna, I don't know, but it's such a beautiful articulation of like, this unconditional love that he always felt. It was just, he was loved no matter what he did. And that's one story, and that is in the book. That is, it's part of how we open the book. And then the one that did get trimmed a little bit was, the relationship with his dad, where, he had this relationship with his dad where his dad, his dad loved and cherished him just his entire life. And, Ron played soccer and baseball growing up. Ron said in all the years, all of his games, his dad was a VP at General Mills, never missed a single game. When, I think maybe he missed one baseball game when Ron was a kid, and was just always there. And, it might seem weird to say now, but like when Ron went to Stanford, I think prior to Stanford, I don't know if Ron somehow had a phone, or no, at Stanford, Ron's dad sent him a letter every week. Every week, Ron's dad wrote him a letter just about what was going on at home. And then when he graduated afterward, and all throughout his time at Apple, Ron's dad, they spoke every single day. And, his dad always reminded him, you have, like, he wrote him a letter in 1989, and part of it does make it into the book, that was like, you have talent beyond that of anyone I know. And, it's your responsibility to do something with this talent. And it wasn't like, you must, whatever. It's like, I believe in you, son, and I believe that you're destined for important things. But then he would always remind him alongside that, but no matter what you do and no matter what decision you make, mom and I will love you no matter what. And so it was this incredible blend of, what I think every child needs and everyone really needs. It's high standards, something to aspire to, and really incredible support. And Ron had both. He had the high standards, the belief in what he was capable of, what you're, but the absolute love from both his mom and his dad that you are loved no matter what you do. And I just think there's so much beauty in that, because I think if you get that right for kids, that's kind of all you can do, right? And it's you set a goal to aspire to, and then you really support them, and then you have to let them go and just live their own life. And I think most of that made it into the book. And my dad read it, and he said, he's like, the biggest thing I took away from it was the power of a great childhood and of great parents. And he's like, it made me want to be a better father. It made me want you to come visit, all these things. And that, it's really, I think it's important to both of us
out of a book
clicks for
about
people.
building Apple retail, right? Like that's the thing about these stories, is that I knew you would pick up on the human storyline here, just knowing who you are, knowing how you look at golf. And that is in anything, all these high performers that, we mythologize or we idolize, or we, they say don't ever meet your heroes. But when you get down to it, there's always some deep motivation. You've uncovered a number of them in Ron's story, but there's a deep motivation. And then there's those lessons that are actually just applicable to life, and not just, retail strategy and how you build stores. It's why I love reading these types of stories specifically, is I always leave with some lesson that maybe applies to business, maybe applies to my golf game, or maybe just applies to me trying to be a dad, or me trying to be a son, or whatever. Because most people wouldn't know that Ron Johnson, or wouldn't think about Ron Johnson as a son and a father and a dad. And so that's awesome through line there on what you've created. The professor Xander always talks about the consumerism of golf, and I'm going to ask this question on his behalf because, I may have taken this from that early essay, because again, it's just top of mind. I read it, and I know you've changed your position on it, which is such a sign, by the way, of intelligence, Xander. We've had a lot of people on this show over 8 years, and some really intelligent ones. But Kevin and I talk about what is like one of the things we respect most of those people that we've enjoyed learning from the most, and it's really that they have the courage to change their mind. They have the courage to take more information and update.
Yeah, and if I could speak to that for a second, I mean, I was kind of trying to get. I told a long story, I don't know, 30 or 45 minutes ago, that I was trying to get back to, why I changed my mind on that stuff. But I'll give you one just very granular example, because it's in the essay. And one of the points I make in that essay is about, the green versus blue text in iMessage. I don't know if you recall that.
Oh yeah,
if you ask,
for sure.
Yeah, it's
and let's be honest, like who doesn't experience that in their own life and be like, we got a green mark in this text chain, that's the worst.
Exactly, but I think the point I made in that is that if you ask most people, whose text is green, if you're an iPhone user texting, with an Android user, whose text is it, yours or is it the Android user? Most of them would say, oh, it's the Android user, because we refer to them as green text. Right? So you think, oh, it's the person with the Android who has the green text, but actually that isn't true. If you look at your iPhone, when you text someone with an Android, it's your text as the iPhone user that turns green. And it's your text as the iPhone user when you're texting with an iPhone that is blue. And so the point is, the point that I made in that essay, which was completely unsubstantiated, but was driven by my belief that Apple was a certain type of company, maybe that tries to peer pressure people into using, a certain thing, is that if you want to create peer pressure, the best way to do it isn't to exclude a group, isn't to say like, we're going to turn the Android messages user, green, isn't to say like they're separate. It's actually to make the Android user influence the iPhone user, where it's like if an Android user's in the chat, then the iPhone user turns green. And so then it's the iPhone user who says, dude, can you just get an iPhone so my chat will turn blue? It's not, you don't want to create separation. You want to create this peer pressure that's like, I don't want to be this thing, so I'm going to convince you to have an iPhone. And that was my, I actually like that take a lot. When I said it and I wrote about it, I was like, this is actually pretty smart. It's one of those things. But I also, after talking to Ron, I just don't think that's true at all. Like, I don't know what the actual truth is, but I think the actual truth is that, as of 2007, when Apple released the iPhone, or 2009, it was released in 2007, people were still on data plans, right? They were still paying for data. They were still paying for texting. And so Apple would have said, like, well, what's a way we can improve our user experience? Apple, they always put the user experience first, and especially so then. And so I think what probably happened, again, I don't know, but I think what probably happened is someone just said, like, well, what if we, there's free Wi-Fi kind of emerging everywhere. What if we allowed the iPhone to text over Wi-Fi? What if we created a Wi-Fi enabled system, and how would we indicate to iPhone users that they're connected to Wi-Fi and that they can use it? It's like, well, what if we made their text turn blue? And then that the texts you're sending are coming in via, or are being sent via Wi-Fi, and that would give birth to iMessage. And then, the green versus blue thing had really nothing to do with Android versus iPhone, but really it just had something to do with showing the user, hey, you're actually connected to Wi-Fi right now, so you can send text for free without racking up, additional data. It's this thing that started as a pure focus on the user experience. And then 5 years down the line, everyone's like, Apple's just trying to separate, Android users and iPhone users, which like is a downstream effect. But I can promise you with almost 99% certainty, even though again, I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again, that wasn't the conversation that was happening in the boardroom, even though that's literally what I said in the essay. I think I said, like, it's hard to escape the conclusion that someone in some boardroom was like, hey, the best way to get someone to switch to an iPhone is to, make their text message make the user's text message a different color.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things
the
where it's
nefarious approach off the bat versus we're actually just trying to improve the experience, and then there's a byproduct that maybe, totally. I think, you wrote somewhere that people don't just buy products, they buy a better version of themselves. And that's where I wanted to take it to golf, because golf might be the most obvious example of that. Right, that there's everything from the equipment we play to the shaft we selected, the membership that we're a part of, the courses that we play and are part of, to the places we go for travel, all the logo bingo you see walking through the airport. Like, I wanted to from everything that you've learned through this journey, right, in the book, like what would be the closest to product, maybe? I don't know if we want to say company, because Apple might be one of one in terms of that, and there's probably not a lot of great comps in golf. But let's go with just the things that we purchase as consumers in golf that you see a very similar trend of buying a better version of yourself. What would you say is kind of that you observe most in golfers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say, and this kind of ties into Apple and why the Apple stores worked, actually. I think one of the things that I always doubted, I'm going to go back to Ron a little bit and then I'll come back to the question. I think one of the things I always doubted when Ron would speak to me, he would say, he's like, yeah, people came to the Apple store because of the people. And I was like, as the writer and the eternal skeptic, it's my job to be like, dude, people came to Apple Store because of the products. You have great products, like, you have the iPod, you have the iPhone, but the reality is that's actually not true. Like they did have great products. That part is true, but every reseller sold Apple's products, at least in like the 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003 era. CompUSA sold them, Best Buy would eventually start selling them. These resellers had the products, but I think what drove a lot of people to the Apple Store is like, they just had great people. They had great people who made you feel good about coming in. You'd feel kind of cooler being there, talking to them. Smart, interesting people. They were fun to talk to. They asked good questions. They knew what they were talking about. And I'm going to tie it back to, with golf, I think we are all kind of like nuts, right? Golfers are all kind of weird. We all have our own like intuitions about how our swings work. And like, like my dad will say like, oh, I move forward on that. I'm like, dude, what does that even mean? Like, you don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. But there are certain people in the golf world who are able to kind of like, and I'm speaking actually about one guy in particular. There's this guy, Nick, who he's an older guy, works at Golf Mart in San Rafael. And every time I go into that Golf Mart, Nick is like talking to some guy, maybe it's my age, maybe it's my dad's age, maybe it's your age. And they're having the most like animated conversation. And the conversation isn't really, it's about like the clubs and getting fit. But oftentimes it's more just like Nick being able to recognize, like to validate and just say like, yeah, that's exactly what's going on. And sort of put words to like what the person is trying to say about their own swing. And I think it's, in a sense, it like gets back to this idea that we kind of like self-actualize through golf. We kind of, I don't know, we find ourselves, and there are just certain people who, they don't, it's like they're just able to like make sense of what we're saying about our own swing to us. And once they do that, then I think sales kind of flow naturally out of that. It's like once someone creates like a true connection with you and like meets you where you are, and it's clear that it's like a relationship where you can come back in and talk to this guy, there's so much magic that could be unlocked there. And it's not selling someone a set of clubs. It's like, hey, yeah, come back here. We'll talk about your game. Hey, how did that tournament go? How did your, really getting invested in like, why are you here? What are you thinking about? What's going on in your mind, and developing that individual one-on-one relationship. And so I think, a lot of, it's kind of why I wonder about clubs. My hope is that most clubs that are, or most golf brands that are doing like fittings are not on commission, or are not doing it that way, because there really is something to be said for the power of like a long-term relationship with someone who's fitting you with your clubs.
Even
Yeah.
just simply reading the description of your book, and I think Ron's philosophy of serving rather than selling, and then thinking about all my trips into the into the Apple store, where like I almost would beg somebody to sell me, on something, because the difference between going in and if I need service, I get service immediately, which is a different way to start a relationship than someone immediately trying to pitch you something that you might not need. Maybe you do, but there's kind of that weird start to a relationship where they're already on edge. You already don't have trust. But that started to resonate with me of like, what is it that made my experiences different? It was always that service very clearly was built into the DNA of that place, and selling was not, but the products are great and your relationship starts to develop, and it's clear that that's in there. Golf could probably learn a lesson from that. Now that I'm thinking about not just buying clubs, but just like the course operators, memberships, it does become, and maybe that's a part of the lesson too. It's like, as you maybe learned through your research for the book and all these years of writing it, golf has lived off a status for a long time, or so we think. But isn't it the great game at its core that is always kind of be the thing that endures? I don't know. I'm trying to draw another parallel from Apple, but it's likely there.
Yeah. Well, no, I think, I'll be honest, like my whole life when I've gone into golf shops, like I can't, it's kind of sad. Like I can't name one where like I went in and like someone knew me by name. Like there's courses, there's countless courses where I played multiple times. There's a course I played in high school. There's the course I played, growing up. I grew up on a golf course. And yet there was just, even the public golf courses, there was always a little bit of a distance between me and like the guy on the other side of the counter, where it's like, it's so different when you walk into a place and they're like, yo, Xander, like, what's up, dude? Like, how are you? And I think, private golf is probably better about that, at having guys that, know your name when you show up and are willing to kind of like shoot the shit with you about, what's going on in your world. But I do think that there's a huge opportunity in that, especially in this whole like AI world where everything's being automated, to bring back and try and train for, or at least instill the type of values in people, when they're young children, that encourage them to understand, like, we're all at our best when, we're made to feel comfortable and like we're seen, that someone really is recognizing us. It makes the round better. It makes our interactions with other people better.
I would love, and maybe this is bucket list stuff, but I would love to play a round of golf with you and Ron and sit there and discuss redefining the retail golf experience of a pro shop, of a clubhouse, the golf course itself. Like, have you guys ever spun off on that in your shared love of golf?
Surprisingly, we haven't. But I think, Ron, I think he'd love that. He loves to talk about, experience, and it's his whole thing is, the power of relationships, the power of kindness, the power of truly seeing people. But again, as I've said, I do think a lot of that, it does come back to, the early years and the early experiences you have and the early ways that you're treated. And I think, again, I go back to this idea that as a parent, I think it's so hard because parents are so busy. There's so much going on in your life. I mean, you're a parent, CEO, you've got so much happening, but the power of kindness and unconditional love, I think, really go a long way. And yeah, but yes, I think Ron would love to talk about, how, because again, you can, that's literally how they designed the Apple Store. It was ground up. It wasn't, they didn't say like, let's build a store and like, where are we going to put the products? It was like, no, what's the customer's experience going to be like? And they mapped it out, from the very beginning. I mean, they knew that they were trying to convert the 95% of people who didn't have Macs, computer owners who didn't have Macs, to come over to Apple. And half of them were going to be, half of people in the US at the time didn't have computers. The other half were on PCs. And so they said, it's like, well, where do we need to go? It's like, well, where do people go? It's like, we're going to be in malls. So they located in malls. And then it said, okay, well, we're in malls, but, people are walking along the 50-yard, walking through the mall. How are we going to get them to turn their head towards us? It's like, well, how does any store get them, get people to turn their head? It's like by having a great window display. That's what department stores did. So they imagined that customer's journey walking through the store and imagine having like the best window displays in the mall. And, throughout the early 2000s, Apple had these incredible window displays. I mean, they brought in this guy, Mike Fisher, who did these amazing window displays. But it wasn't enough, now people are in the store. They've gotten, they've walked in. It's like, well, how do we design the store from here? It's like, well, what are we really doing in here? Like, really what we're doing in here is we're launching people's relationships with Apple and with technology. And so, what are you doing in any relationship? It's like, well, in any good relationship, you should be doing one of three things. You should be launching, you should be deepening, or you should be restoring. Those are the three things: launch, deepen, restore. And so how do we do that? It's like, well, what if we dedicate the front 50% of the store to launching customers' relationships with Apple? And what if we dedicate the back 50% of the store to deepening and restoring those relationships with Apple? So the front 50% is products. You can kind of learn about the products. The back 50% is the theater, where you can take classes and learn, deepen your relationship with your product. Or if your relationship with your computer or Apple is broken because something on the computer broke, you can go to the Genius Bar and get it fixed. And so they have this whole flow imagined. It seems very obvious, but there's a million other ways they could have done it. But this was the very clear and very simple way: locate in malls, have a great window display that attracts people, launch, deepen, restore once they're inside. And of course, this also requires hiring great people and giving them a very specific way, a kind of the guardrails within which, they can interact with customers and use their creativity and their intuition. But it all started with, I think, greet customers with a warm welcome and, uncover and kind of learn about their needs, present a solution for them to bring home today, and then fond farewell. And it was just this very simple way. And I think, again, I think Ron, imagining is so much fun. It'd be really fun to get him into a room and, we start talking about golf and just imagine, what could that look like? If we really reimagined the club from the ground up, what would that be like? With an emphasis on serving the golfer, really making it about them.
And I love
I think it's fascinating.
Oh, I mean, the three pillars there of a relationship: launching, deepening, and restoring. You can point to that plenty in the game of golf. And I don't think there's many courses or clubs out there that look at it that way. We certainly do. We definitely, in New Club could be, there's so many lessons in your story, which I'll be applying to New Club. I want to ask you two more questions here, because I could go with you all day, Xander, and we need to play golf soon to pick it up. And if any members of New Club are listening, you too need to play golf with Xander, because he's just, like we've said earlier, a competitor, a gentleman, but just a good time and adds a lot to your round. But I'm curious, just in golf, like, you've had this awesome golf journey. You're obviously incredibly thoughtful and reflective. Is there something that golf has given you that you never really knew it was giving you at the time? Like, is there something that's just not obvious, but it's the thing you look at in hindsight and you're like, man, thank God I got introduced to golf?
Yeah, I think golf helped me recognize what it is to be truly passionate about something. Because when I first started playing golf in high school, I remember it was kind of like, oh, you play golf? Like, that's weird. And I'd always, I don't know, I'm kind of a sensitive guy, and I always.
What year did you graduate high school, though? There was a turning point.
2012.
Okay, so it's still, well, kids weren't watching Tiger at that time. They kind of
were
calling your name.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I was just I gave off the vibe of someone who like wasn't super confident, and I was just easy to pick on. Who knows?
Golfers,
I don't know what.
golfers were easy subjects, but I get it. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know exactly what it was, but I do kind of remember just being like, I think it was mostly like girls, man. I was like, why are you playing golf? Like that's like weird, You actually, Tiger Woods aside, it's just that was just sort of the reaction to it, and I'd always really cared. Like I said, I'm a sensitive guy, and I've always really cared what people thought. And I just remember golf was like the first time where people would kind of make fun of it, and I just didn't care. I just didn't care. I just didn't. It was just all I wanted to be doing. I was out on the course every night during the summer. I've such great. My parents were like redoing our backyard. I remember in the summer after my freshman year, and so the whole backyard just flowed out. And it was we lived on a golf course, a public golf course. Peacock Gap Golf and Country Club. God bless it. And just every day I'd be out there for 8 hours a day with my friend Tucker, and then I'd walk back and I'd walk over like the mound of dirt to get back into our backyard. And that was just every day. And me and my high school buddies would talk about it all the time. We're trying to win the club championship against Marin Academy, or win the league championship against Marin Academy our senior year. And our high school was brand new. We were our 5th graduating class. And we did actually end up winning that championship. But yeah, it gave me, I don't think I knew it at the time, but it showed me what it is to truly love something where you just have no doubt. You just, again, love is like pressure. No one can tell you you're experiencing it. You just know, and there's no doubt in your mind. And that was how I felt about golf for a really long time. And I do think that's important because it allows you to, when you're going through life, going back to our conversation about every idea has its time, right? Or doesn't have its time. But a good idea, if it's not delivered at the right time, there is no idea. It needs to be in the right moment. The most important, I think, skill that people can have in life is being able to feel exactly where they are and feel the context of their moment and exactly what that moment needs. And I guess my golf demonstrated to me what it felt like to truly love something. And then I found that I was able to remind myself that I was experiencing that with writing, where I was like, I should keep doing this because there's just no doubt in my head that this is what I'm meant to do.
Yes.
And
yeah. Oh, that's I'll take it to, for some people, it's not golf, it's something else. But until you realize what it is that lights you up inside, that gives you an additional, you talked about Ron waking up in the morning for the next challenge, so excited. Until you realize what those things are, you don't know how to recognize what the next thing is. And so for yours was writing, and you were able to recognize, wow, I'm having similar feelings to what? Oh yeah, that golf thing that I obsess over. And I always call it there's a lot of people I talk to that are looking to get into the golf industry, that they want to work in golf because they feel similarly. But I always tell them what you need to make sure of is that there is that deeper, sometimes I call it obsession, sometimes I call it motivation, passion, for all of it, for the full spectrum of it. And the reason you need to make sure of that is because anything, whether you love it or not, gets hard. And so if there is that intrinsic piece for you to what you're doing, it actually becomes your unique advantage. It actually becomes the thing that, like, no, because I'm looking at, the detail of this thing in a way that many, many, many people have not. It's going to become your unique advantage in whether that's as a competitor on the golf course or someone that works in the golf industry. And it's the same, I think, for writing and any pursuit that you take. You got to have something that's going to carry you through those times. So if you don't have that light, if you don't have that spark, it's going to get really hard, and you're probably going to quit, as many have, which is fine because that's part of the learning process, right? Is
absolutely
failing and moving on to the next thing.
Yeah, it's really important to know to just try things and do stuff. I think, again, action is always better than inaction. Just trying something and learning, like I'm paying attention to how I feel about this right now, and I'm not feeling it. And again, there's no one can tell you when something's right or when it's not. You just have to do it, and you just have to pay attention to how you feel. And I don't know how to tell someone to do that other than, just to take action within your certain circumstances, within your certain context. And I don't know. I kind of think that people know what they need to do deep down. I think that's part of what writing, that's why, and I feel like I know that kind of innately because again, I go back to that quote, good writing is the act of hearing yourself say things you didn't know you knew. And I think that's a lot of what, I don't know, people need more of. So I'm sorry, man. I've got if you have time for one more question, I got to run at 11
I know.
here.
I will. We'll end with this one, and it'll be
sure.
We started with New Club. We'll end with it. Well, I'll start with an apology. I had a wonderful introduction for you, obviously, but the thing I left off the list was not only are you sitting captain for New Club Chicago, you're our club champ, and so that was rude. You overcome the great Brian McCarty, who was unbeatable in Chicagoland for 4 years. So there's that. So I just had to add that to the transcript here, make sure it was documented that you are also club champ, which harkens back to the old days. Clubs used to do that. It was really just, who's our captain? I don't know. Who's the best golfer? Who won the club championship? Okay, that's our captain. That's not how it unplayed. You have the qualities we look for in a captain. But I just want to ask you, Xander, you've been such a great captain in this first half of the year or whatever it is already for Chicago. We do the 2-year terms. I know it takes a community, it takes a village. There's so many cool things going on. We have a bunch of momentum. I want to hear from you. Like, what do you hope in this 2 years' time? What will members then feel and say about New Club that they may not now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. It's kind of like the old interview question of, what do you want? In 6 months, what could I have done to have made you say, like, I'm the best hire you ever made? Matt, I don't, nothing's really coming to me right now. Maybe it's because it's the end of the interview. I want people to feel like they're a part of it. I personally, I've spent a lot of my life kind of feeling like I was a little bit separate from other things. Like I never really felt like I quite fit in. And, I think that's part of why I found golf, and part of what I loved about it was that I finally felt like I had a place where I fit in and like I mattered and like I meant something. And I think I'd want every member, of New Club to feel like they fit in some way, like they have some part in the club, whether it's playing at a medal or, having won a match play event or just, having been out and had a meaningful moment on the golf course. I just want people to feel like they're a part of it. And so maybe that's kind of the guiding light for me is just, how do we make every member feel like they're a part of this club, even as a club that doesn't have a physical space. And, I think most members would say that, but I think there are a fair number of members who feel like, I'm a member of New Club, but I don't know if I really feel like I'm a part of it yet. And I'd want, more, if not, obviously all members feeling that way would be the goal, but I'd want many more to feel like they're really a part of this.
I literally can't think of a better answer than that. So you wrapped this up well. Hey, Dan, thanks, man, for joining us today. Can't wait to pick up your book. It's Shop Different. We'll add it to the show notes for you guys listening, so you can order right there. And thanks to everybody for listening. We can't do this show without you guys, both members of New Club and listeners. If you're not a subscriber, please do. It helps the professor and I keep having conversations with thoughtful people like Xander. Like, rate, review, shoot us an email, tell us what you hate, and we're happy to talk to anybody that's a part of this community and loves the game of golf. We'll include all those links in our show notes. And thanks, of course, to our friends at Titleist. The Backdrop and New Club Golf Society are in partnership with Titleist. The all-new GTS medals are out now, and you can get fit by a certified Titleist fitter near you at Titleist.com. We'll catch you all on the next one.
Thanks, Matt.